It was a typical Tuesday morning when I received the email that would turn my week upside down. Sitting at my desk, I sipped my usual coffee while absent-mindedly scanning my inbox. Suddenly, a name caught my eye, Madame Elise Dupont, my mother-in-law. My heart sank instantly. Our relationship had never been right since I married her son, Pierre, 3 years ago. Intrigued and slightly anxious, I opened the message. To my surprise, it was an invitation. Madame Dupont was inviting me, Sophie Lefevre, to an exclusive soirée of Parisian high society. The event was to take place the following Saturday in their sumptuous 16th arrondissement home. I leaned back in my chair, puzzled. Why now? Why me? Elise had never hidden her contempt for my modest origins, considering me unworthy of her son. This sudden invitation was suspicious, to say the least. I reread the invitation several times, looking for a clue, an explanation. The tone was cordial, almost warm, a radical change from my mother-in-law's usual coldness. She even mentioned that it would be an excellent opportunity to get to know each other better. I laughed bitterly. After 3 years of disdainful looks and sharp remarks, it was hard to believe such a sudden turnaround. Despite my doubts, part of me was curious. Perhaps this really was an attempt at reconciliation? Or at least, an opportunity to show that I could fit into their world. After all, I'd worked hard to adapt to this new environment since my marriage to Pierre. I decided to tell my husband that evening. When Pierre came home from work, I showed him the invitation. "This is unexpected," he said, frowning. "My mother didn't tell me about it." "What do you think?" I asked, watching for her reaction. "Should I go?" Pierre hesitated a moment before answering. "I think so. Maybe it's a step towards getting along better. Besides, it could be a good opportunity for you to meet influential people." I nodded, not totally convinced. "You're right. I'll accept." The next day, I responded to the invitation, confirming my presence. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. What should I wear? How should I behave? I wanted to make a good impression, to show that I could measure up to this world that had always seemed so inaccessible to me. On Thursday evening, as I was finalizing my choice of dress, my phone rang. It was Mark, a close friend who ran in the same circles as the Duponts. His voice sounded strained. "Sophie, I need to talk to you about something important." My heart quickened. "What's going on, Mark?" He took a deep breath. "I've heard rumors about Saturday's party. It seems your stepmother has some special intentions in inviting you." I felt a shiver run through me. "What kind of intentions?" "She would intend to publicly humiliate you, Sophie. To portray you as an upstart, a fortune hunter who married Pierre for his money." The shock nailed me to the spot. Although I'd always been suspicious of Elise's intentions, I'd never imagined she'd go this far. How do you know that?" I stammered. Mark sighed. "I overheard a conversation between her and one of her friends at the club. She seemed very proud of her plan." "I'm sorry, Sophie. I thought you should know." After hanging up, I stood still, trying to process this information. Anger, sadness, and humiliation mixed inside me. How could she be so cruel? I spent the night thinking, weighing my options. Should I cancel my visit? Confront Elise? Tell Pierre? Each of these options seemed unsatisfactory. In the wee hours of the morning, an idea began to germinate in my mind. What if, instead of running away or letting myself be tricked, I used this information to my advantage? If Elise wanted to play this game, I was going to play it too, but with my own rules. I decided to keep this revelation to myself, even from Pierre. I didn't want to put him in a difficult position between his mother and me. Besides, the fewer people who knew about it, the more genuine and surprising my reaction would be. The next 2 days were a mixture of nervous anticipation and meticulous preparation. I polished my appearance, chose my words carefully and, above all, gathered information. Information that might come in handy when the time came. Saturday came faster than I expected. As I put the finishing touches to my makeup, Pierre looked at me with admiration. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing me on the cheek. "Ready for the evening?" I smiled, hiding my apprehension. "More than ever." Climbing into the car, I took a deep breath. Tonight, everything was going to change. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to let myself be humiliated without reacting. Elise Dupont was about to discover that Sophie Lefevre is not to be underestimated. The drive to the Dupont mansion was silent. Pierre, perhaps sensing my tension, didn't try to make conversation. As for me, I was deep in thought, mentally rehearsing the various possible scenarios. As we neared our destination, I felt my heart quicken. The moment of truth was approaching. Whatever happened tonight, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The car stopped in front of the imposing Dupont mansion. I stood still for a moment, gathering my courage before getting out. Pierre held out his hand, a reassuring gesture that gave me the strength to face what lay ahead. As soon as we crossed the threshold, I could feel all eyes on us. The lobby was packed with guests, all dressed in lavish outfits that screamed high society. I straightened my shoulders, determined not to be intimidated. "Sophie, Pierre, here you are at last." Elise Dupont's honeyed voice echoed through the hall. My mother-in-law approached, a smile frozen on her perfectly made-up face. She wore a bright red evening gown, her steel-grey hair styled into an impeccable bun. "Good evening, Maman," Pierre said, kissing her on the cheek. Elise turned to me, her gaze scanning me up and down. "Sophie, my dear, what a lovely outfit." I felt the weight of her judgment in every syllable. My dress, while elegant, was clearly not up to her standards. "Thank you, Elise," I replied with a forced smile. "Your evening seems to be a great success." "Oh, it's just the beginning," she said with a little laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "Come, let me introduce you to a few people." As Elise led us through the crowd, I felt the curious glances and whispers as we passed. It was clear that my presence was a topic of conversation. "These are the Moreaus," Elise announced as we stopped in front of an elderly couple. "Jean-Luc is an eminent surgeon, and his wife Claudine is president of a high-profile charity." Introductions followed, each name accompanied by an impressive title or remarkable achievement. I tried to remain smiling and polite, even though I could feel the social gap widening with each new encounter. "And what do you do for a living, my dear?" asked Claudine Moreau with a condescending smile. Before I could answer, Elise intervened. "Oh, Sophie is between jobs at the moment. Isn't that right, dear?" I gritted my teeth, feeling the trap closing in. "Indeed, I'm in a phase of professional transition," I replied calmly. "I see this as an opportunity to explore new avenues." Claudine nodded with a falsely understanding air. Of course. It's not easy to find your place when you come from a different background." Dinner was announced shortly afterwards, offering us a temporary respite. As we made our way to the dining room, Pierre took my hand, squeezing it gently in support. I smiled at him, grateful for his silent presence by my side. The table was a spectacle in itself, set with fine crockery and silver cutlery that gleamed in the candlelight. I was placed between Pierre and a businessman named Francois, while Elise sat at the end of the table, presiding over dinner like a queen on her throne. The meal began, and with it a new wave of polite but innuendo-laden conversation. Elise seemed to take a malicious pleasure in steering the discussion towards topics that highlighted my lack of knowledge in certain areas. "Sophie, what do you think of the latest exhibition at the Louvre?" asked Francois between bites of foie gras. I hesitated for a moment. "I must confess I haven't had a chance to see her yet," I replied honestly. Elise seized the opportunity. "Oh, it's true that museums aren't really your usual milieu, are they, Sophie?" I felt the red flush my cheeks, but kept my composure. "It's true that my parents didn't often take me to museums as a child," I admitted. "But I've always been curious about learning and discovering new things." Of course, Elise echoed with a honeyed smile. "It's admirable to want to rise above your origins." The conversations continued in this tone throughout the meal. Every time I thought I'd found a safe topic, Elise would find a way to turn the situation to my disadvantage. She would subtly evoke my lack of prestigious education, my lack of influential connections, or my ignorance of certain social codes. "You know," she said at one point, addressing the entire table, I find it fascinating how some people manage to adapt to a new environment. Isn't that right, Sophie? I felt all eyes turn to me. Indeed, I replied, striving to keep my voice steady. Every experience is a learning opportunity. Oh, how pragmatic, commented a woman sitting across from me, her tone suggesting it wasn't a compliment. As the evening wore on, I could feel my resolve crumbling. Every remark, every sidelong glance was like a stab. I glanced at Pierre, hoping to find support, but he seemed uncomfortable and avoided my gaze. Just as dessert was being served, a sumptuous chocolate cake that I couldn't even appreciate because my stomach was in knots, I heard Elise address the assembled guests. "My dear friends," she began, raising her glass of champagne. "I'm so happy to have you all here tonight. You know, family is the most important thing to me." His gaze settled on me, and I knew the moment I'd been dreading had arrived. And sometimes, the family grows in unexpected ways. Right, Sophie? I felt my heart quicken. The trap was closing, but I wasn't ready to strike back. Not yet, that is. Yes, Elise, I replied calmly. Life is full of surprises. She laughed, a sound that had nothing warm about it. Oh, indeed. And some surprises are more interesting than others. Silence fell over the table. Everyone seemed to be waiting for what would happen next, like an audience holding its breath before the climax of the show. I glanced around the table, observing the curious faces, some showing thinly veiled pity, others unhealthy anticipation. Pierre, next to me, seemed frozen, unable to react. It was then that I realized that the moment of truth was approaching. Everything I'd endured so far was just a prelude. Elise had prepared her coup de grace, and it would soon fall. But despite the fear that knotted my stomach, part of me was ready. Ready to face what was coming, ready to defend my dignity. For if Elise thought she could humiliate me without consequence, she would soon discover that she had gravely underestimated the woman I had become. The silence in the dining room was palpable. All eyes were riveted on Elise, waiting for the next part of her speech. I took a deep breath, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. Elise swirled the wine in her glass, a satisfied smile on her lips. "My dear friends," she resumed, "as you know, our family has always stood for tradition, excellence and social distinction." She paused, her gaze settling on me. "However, times change, don't they? Sometimes we find ourselves faced with unexpected situations." I felt Pierre stiffen beside me. He must have begun to understand what his mother was getting at. "Sophie," Elise continued, addressing me directly but speaking loud enough for the whole table to hear, "why don't you tell us a little about your origins? I'm sure our guests would be fascinated to hear about your atypical background." I swallowed hard, feeling all eyes turn to me. "What exactly do you want to know, Elise?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady. She laughed, a cold, calculating sound. "Oh, you know, those little things that make you, you. Your childhood neighborhood, the public school you went to, the odd job you had before you met Pierre. Those details that show where you really come from." Murmurs began to rise around the table. I saw some guests exchange knowing glances, others display an unhealthy curiosity. "Well," I began, "I grew up in the 20th arrondissement. My parents were hard workers who did their best to give me a good education." "The 20th, interrupted a woman at the other end of the table. "Isn't that where Belleville is?" Elise smiled, as if she'd just been given a present. "Indeed, Marguerite. Sophie is a true Belleville girl. Isn't that quaint?" The word quaint was uttered with such disdain that I felt anger welling up inside me. But I tried to remain calm. "Belleville is a neighborhood rich in diversity and culture," I replied. "I'm proud of it." "Oh, of course," Elise echoed. "Diversity is so enriching. And tell me, Sophie, what was that little job you were doing before you met our Pierre?" I took a deep breath. I was a waitress in a coffee shop. The reactions around the table were immediate. Hiccups of surprise, sympathetic glances, mocking smiles. "A waitress," exclaimed Francois, the businessman sitting next to me. "Well, what an impressive career change." Elise seemed to savor every second. "Isn't it? It's almost like a modern fairy tale." The little waitress who marries Prince Charming. Laughter erupted around the table, barely concealed behind manicured hands and glasses of champagne. And tell me, Sophie, Elise continued, her tone becoming increasingly condescending, how does a young woman of your background end up at a party like this? Marrying a man like Pierre? The silence fell again, everyone waiting for my answer. I glanced at Pierre, hoping for support, but he was staring at his plate, clearly uncomfortable. Love knows no social boundaries, Elise, I replied, striving to maintain my dignity. Pierre and I met, we fell in love. It's as simple as that. Elise burst out laughing, a cold, cruel sound that echoed throughout the room. Love. Of course, that's always what they say, isn't it? But let's be honest, my dear. Was there really no other appeal? I felt my face flush under the thinly veiled accusation. Around the table, guests murmured, some nodding as if Elise had just confirmed their suspicions. I don't know what you're insinuating, Elise, I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to remain calm. Oh, let's not be naive, she replied. A young woman from modest origins suddenly marrying the heir to one of the most influential families in Paris. One can't help but wonder, can one? The murmurs intensified. I heard someone whisper fortune hunter and my heart clenched. I assure you my feelings for Pierre are sincere, I insisted, sensing I was losing control of the situation. Elise brushed aside my protest with a wave of her hand. Oh, I don't doubt it, my dear. But you must admit that Pierre's bank account must have been a not inconsiderable bonus. The laughter started again, louder this time. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. It's fascinating, really, continued Elise, now addressing the entire table. To see how some people will do anything to rise socially. It's almost admirable, in a way. I looked around the table, searching for a sympathetic face, but found only mocking or embarrassed glances. Even Pierre seemed unable to defend me, paralyzed by the situation. I think you're wrong about me, Elise, I said, my voice barely audible. Oh, really, she replied, her tone brimming with sarcasm. Then enlighten us, Sophie. Tell us what in your life's journey prepared you for this world. For our world. The challenge in her voice was clear. She had cornered me, pushing me to justify myself in front of all these people who were already judging me. I took a deep breath, feeling that the crucial moment had arrived. Everything I'd endured so far, all the derogatory remarks, the condescending looks, it was all culminating in this moment. Elise thought she'd tricked me, thought she'd humiliated me to the point where I'd never be able to raise my head again in this world of hers. But she didn't know one crucial thing about me. I stood up slowly, feeling all eyes on me. The silence was total, the atmosphere electric. Do you want to know what prepared me for this world, Elise? Said I, my voice stronger and more assured than I would have thought possible. You want to know the truth about my origins, about who I really am? Elise raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised by my sudden surge of confidence. Oh, I'm all ears, my dear, she said, a wry smile on her lips. I took one last breath, knowing that what I was about to say would change the course of the evening, and probably my life. Very well, I said, my gaze roaming the table before settling on Elise. Then let me tell you a story. A story you certainly didn't expect to hear tonight. The silence in the dining room was deafening. All eyes were on me, a mixture of unhealthy curiosity and palpable anticipation in the air. Elise, seated at the head of the table, was still wearing her smug smile, but I could see a glint of concern in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to retaliate. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of this moment. What I was about to reveal would change everything, and there would be no turning back. You think you know everything about me, don't you, Elise? I began, my voice calm but firm. You think I'm a simple girl from Belleville, a waitress who was lucky enough to catch a rich man. But the truth is far more complex than that. I paused, letting my words have their effect. The guests were hanging on my every word, waiting for the next part with barely concealed impatience. It's true that I grew up in Belleville. It's true that I worked as a waitress. But what you don't know is that it was all part of a choice. My choice. Elise frowned, visibly disconcerted. What do you mean? I smiled, for the first time all evening feeling in control. What I mean to say, Elise, is that I'm not the person you think I am. I'm the heiress to the Beaumont family. Hiccups of surprise echoed around the table. The Beaumont name was well known in Parisian high society circles, associated with a considerable fortune and an influence that extended far beyond France's borders. It's impossible, Elise murmured, her confidence visibly crumbling. And yet, it's the truth, I continued. My real name is Sophie Beaumont. My parents, Henri and Marie Beaumont, made their fortune in the pharmaceutical industry. But they raised me with values different from those usually found in this milieu. I pulled an envelope I'd prepared for the occasion from my purse. Here are the documents that prove my identity and inheritance. Certified copies of my birth certificate, bank documents, property deeds. It's all here. I passed the envelope to Francois, the businessman sitting next to me, who began examining the documents with undisguised interest. But, why? Asked Pierre, speaking for the first time all evening. His face expressed a mixture of confusion and betrayal. I turned to him, my heart clenching at the sight of his pain. I'm sorry I kept this from you, Pierre. But I wanted to make sure that someone would love me for who I really am, not for my name or my fortune. I resumed my tale, addressing the entire table. When I turned 18, I made the decision to live a normal life, away from the privileges and expectations that came with my name. I wanted to understand the real world, not just the gilded microcosm I'd grown up in. The guests listened, fascinated. Even Elise seemed to have lost her usual morgue. I moved to Belleville, got a job as a waitress, and started building a life on my own. That's when I met Pierre. And I fell in love with him, not for his money or his social status, but for the person he is. I looked Pierre in the eye, hoping he'd understand. I hid the truth from you because I wanted to be sure that our love was real, that it wasn't based on material considerations. Francois finished examining the documents and passed them to his neighbor. These papers look authentic, he said, admiration piercing through his voice. They are, I confirmed. My personal fortune exceeds that of the Dupont family. I had no need to marry Pierre for his money. This revelation provoked a new wave of murmurs around the table. I could see the looks change from contempt to admiration, even envy for some. Elise seemed to have lost all her superbness. Her face had paled, and she looked at the documents circulating around the table with an expression of incredulity. But, why reveal all this now? Asked Claudine Moreau, the surgeon's wife. I took a deep breath. Because I couldn't stand the disparaging remarks, the condescending looks, the petty insinuations any longer. I'm proud of where I come from, proud of the person I've become through my experiences. And I won't let anyone make me feel inferior or unworthy again. My gaze settled on Elise. You thought you'd humiliate me tonight, didn't you, Elise? To present me as an upstart, a fortune hunter. But the truth is, I chose this life, I chose your son, out of love, not self-interest. Elise seemed unable to speak, her face oscillating between anger and humiliation. I understand that this revelation may be shocking to some of you, I continued, addressing all the guests. But I hope it will make you think about how you judge others. Appearances can be deceiving, and a person's true worth isn't measured by their bank account or their last name. A heavy silence fell over the table. The guests seemed to be digesting this information, some exchanging embarrassed glances, others seeming to completely reassess their opinion of me. Pierre stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on me. Sophie. I don't know what to say. I felt my heart clench. I understand why you might feel betrayed, Pierre. But everything we experienced together was real. My feelings for you are genuine. He nodded slowly, as if still trying to comprehend the full magnitude of the situation. Francois spoke up, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Well, MME Beaumont, or should I say MME Dupont, I think we all owe you an apology for our behavior this evening. Other guests murmured their agreement, some seeming genuinely ashamed of their previous attitude. Elise, meanwhile, seemed to have regained some of her composure. I don't know what to say, Sophie. I never imagined. No, you never would have imagined, I replied calmly. Because you were too busy judging on appearances to take the time to really get to know me. I looked around the table, observing the faces that stared at me with a mixture of respect and curiosity. I hope this evening serves as a lesson to all. A person's worth is not measured by their bank account or pedigree, but by their actions and character. The silence in the dining room was now charged with palpable tension. Glances wavered between me, Elise and Pierre, as if the guests were watching a play whose outcome was still uncertain. I took a deep breath, knowing that this moment would define not only the end of the evening, but also the future of my relationship with the Dupont family and the world to which I now fully belonged. Elise was the first to break the silence. Her voice, usually so assured, trembled slightly. "Sophie. Mademoiselle Beaumont. I don't know what to say." I looked my mother-in-law straight in the eye, feeling a mixture of compassion and determination. "You don't need to say anything, Elise. Your actions have spoken for you tonight." Pierre, who had remained silent since my revelation, finally turned to me. His face reflected a mixture of confusion, pain, and admiration. "Sophie, why didn't you ever tell me?" I took her hand in mine, feeling the gaze of all the guests on us. "Pierre, I wanted to tell you so many times. But I was afraid. Afraid it would change what we had, afraid you'd see me differently. I wanted to make sure our love was based on who we really are, not our last names or our bank accounts." He squeezed my hand in return, a small smile playing on his lips. "You should have trusted me." "I know," I replied softly. "And I promise that from now on, there will be no more secrets between us." Francois, the businessman who had been examining my documents, cleared his throat. "Well, I think we can all agree that this evening has taken an unexpected turn." Murmurs of assent ran through the table. Some guests still seemed stunned by the revelation, others now flashed respectful smiles at me. Claudine Moreau, who had looked at me with disdain earlier in the evening, leaned towards me. "Mademoiselle Beaumont, or should I say Madame Dupont? I would like to apologize for my behavior this evening. I was quick to judge, and I realize now how wrong I was." I nodded in acceptance. "Thank you, Madame Moreau. I appreciate your honesty." Other guests began to express similar sentiments, some openly apologetic, others seeking to engage the conversation in a far more respectful tone than before. Elise, however, still seemed to be struggling to regain her composure. She stood up abruptly, drawing everyone's attention. I think we should move to the living room for coffee." The guests began to rise, the atmosphere charged with new energy. As we made our way into the living room, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Elise. "Sophie," she said in a low voice, "could we talk privately for a moment?" I nodded, following my mother-in-law into an adjacent room. Once alone, Elise turned to me, her face a mask of inner conflict. "I don't know where to begin," she said, her voice devoid of its usual assurance. "What I did tonight, it was cruel and unjustified." I took a deep breath. "Yes, it was." Elise lowered her eyes. I thought I was protecting my son, our family. But I realize now that I was motivated by my own prejudices and insecurities." "Elise," I said softly, "I understand that you want to protect Pierre and your family. But have you ever thought about really knowing me? To see beyond appearances?" She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, I didn't. And I'm deeply sorry." I felt a mixture of compassion and determination. "I can't say what you did tonight didn't hurt. It did hurt. But I'm ready to move on if you are too." Elise looked at me in surprise. "You'd be willing to forgive me? After all I've done?" I nodded. "Forgiveness doesn't mean that what you did was acceptable. It means I choose not to let your actions define our future relationship. But that will also depend on you, Elise. Are you ready to see me for who I really am?" She took my hands in hers, a gesture that surprised me with its sincerity. "Yes, Sophie. I want to get to know you, the real you." We returned to the living room, where the guests were chatting animatedly. Pierre immediately approached us, his worried gaze shifting from me to his mother. "Is everything all right?" he asked. I exchanged a look with Elise before answering. "Yes, Pierre. I think we're on the road to a new beginning." The rest of the evening passed in a strangely relaxed atmosphere. The guests, freed from the shackles of initial prejudice, were curious about my background and experiences. I shared anecdotes about my life in Belleville, what I'd learned working as a waitress, and how these experiences had shaped my worldview. Towards the end of the evening, as the guests began to leave, Francois approached me one last time. "Madame Dupont," he said with a respectful smile, "I must confess that you have surprised us all this evening. Your story is remarkable, and your grace in the face of adversity is admirable. I hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss business one day." I smiled back. "Thank you, Monsieur Francois. I'd be delighted to explore professional opportunities in the future." As the last guest left, I found myself alone with Pierre and Elise in the large living room. A comfortable silence settled between us, each of us absorbed in our own reflections on the evening's events. Pierre finally spoke up. "I think the three of us have a lot to talk about." Elise nodded. "Indeed. But perhaps we should do it tomorrow, with rested minds." I nodded, feeling the fatigue of this emotional evening catch up with me. "I agree. We all need time to digest what's happened." As we prepared to leave, Elise surprised me once again with a hug. "Thank you, Sophie," she whispered. "Thank you for giving us a chance to make things right." As I left the Dupont house that night, hand in hand with Pierre, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The evening had been a turning point, not only for me, but for the whole Dupont family. I looked out the car window at the lights of Paris, reflecting on all that had happened. The truth had come out in a way I could never have predicted, but perhaps it was for the best. For the first time in a long time, I felt free to be myself. The future remained uncertain. No doubt there would still be challenges to overcome, adjustments to make. But tonight, I had proved that I was stronger than the prejudices and expectations of others. I had shown that a person's true worth is not measured by their bank account or their family name, but by their character and their actions. As the car pulled up in front of our apartment, Pierre turned to me. "I love you, Sophie. Belleville waitress, Beaumont heiress, whatever. I love you." I smiled, feeling my heart swell with love and gratitude. "I love you too, Pierre. Thank you for staying by my side tonight." As I walked up the stairs to our apartment, I realized that this evening was not an end, but a new beginning. A beginning where I could finally be completely myself, without fear or shame. And that was perhaps the greatest victory of all.